Great. Well, let's go ahead and begin. Again, welcome to Faculty Focus. My name is Jeff Allum. I'm the Director of Research, and I'm also the moderator for Faculty Focus. This is an occasional seminar, occasional webinar that we hold for members of the legal education community to talk about issues that pertain to legal education in this day and age. And today we have a really terrific lineup of speakers. We have two speakers that are well known in many of the AALS circles. We're really happy to have them here. They're going to be talking about drafting and grading exams and providing meaningful feedback, a very timely conversation for sure. The discussion is going to be led by AALS President Vince Rougeot, who's the Dean of Boston College Law School, and the AALS Past President Darby Dickerson, who's the Dean of the University of Illinois at Chicago John Marshall Law School. Let me describe briefly how this is going to work. Today, Vince and Darby, our co-hosts, are going to offer some initial welcoming remarks. And then each of our two speakers will have about 15 minutes to share their words of wisdom, some ideas, some thoughts on this particular topic. And then at the end, there'll be some opportunity for some moderated Q&A. Now, all of you in the audience today will be muted, but that doesn't mean that we don't want to hear from you. We certainly do. Please, we encourage you to use the chat features as well as the Q&A features for any of your specific questions. And again, Vince and Darby at the end will be using that for the question answer period. So with that, I'm going to turn the floor over to Vince and let him welcome our guests.
Well, thanks so much, Jeff. Welcome everyone to Faculty Focus. It's my pleasure to be with you here this afternoon on behalf of all of us at the AALS and on behalf of my previous past president, Darby Dickerson, and myself. We have a great topic for you on Faculty Focus today. And what we attempt to do with Faculty Focus is to give you an opportunity to engage as a community on issues that are critical to all of us as members of the Legal Academy. And I can't think of a better topic than one we have today. And it reminded me of my early years in the Academy when my senior colleagues said to me, "We teach for free and they pay us to grade exams." Maybe that's a little bit of an exaggeration, but certainly there's a lot of really hard and important work involved in the grading of examinations and the feedback that is required to really give our students the kind of education that they need. And we've got two great people here to tell us more about that. But before I introduce them, I want to give my colleague Darby Dickerson a moment to offer her welcome as well.
Thanks, Vince, and welcome to everyone who's joining us today and who might join us later for the recording. We're glad you're here. We offer this Faculty Focus series as a service to our faculty members. And as we think about the future of this service, we would really like your feedback on topics that would be helpful to you. So if there's something that you would like to hear about, let me or Vince or Jeff know, and we will put that into the mix and see if we can put together a quality program on that topic in the future. We are your organization and here to serve you. I think it's going to be a great session. I'm looking forward to the discussion. I'm going to be moderating the Q&A today. Please put any questions you have in the Q&A box, not into the chat, and that will be quite helpful. And start those questions coming so that I can get them organized. We want to hear your input as well. Back to you, Vince.
Thanks, Darby. So let me introduce our experts for today. First, we'll be hearing from Chris Franklin, who's Professor and Director of Academic Initiatives, Co-Director of the Initiative on Excellence in Law Teaching at New York Law School. And then Chris will be followed by Rory Bahadur, Professor and James R. Ahrens Chair in Tort Law at Washburn University School of Law, excuse me. Chris, let's start with you.
Good afternoon, everybody. So I was asked to talk about designing exams, grading exams, giving feedback on exams, and I'm not going to start it all from exams. I'm going to start talking about the fact that I think you begin planning your exam when you write your course syllabus. And if you're not teaching with an eye toward what you're going to test over the course of the semester, you're probably not setting your students up to write exams that are going to make you a happy person in December. My personal goal is to be as happy as possible in December. No one is thrilled when they're grading a lot of exams. So I think it's really important that we try to make ourselves as pleased as possible. And the way we do that is by working on it all semester. So I'm going to start with the fact that I think one of the first questions you have to ask yourself, and I think the answer for this varies a little bit for each of us and a little bit depending on whether you're teaching a first year course or an upper level course, but to what degree are you testing the substantive material you're covering? And to what degree are you testing the sort of the analytical skills, the lawyerly reasoning that you want for your students? If you're not, I would assume the answer is we're all testing both of those things, but I think the proportion may vary a little bit. But if you expect to test both of those, you need to teach both of those over the course of the semester. And then you need to have your students believe and understand that you are testing both of those. Otherwise, they're not preparing for the sport you want them to compete in, and you are setting yourself up to be an unhappy person in December. So what do you do? How do you do that? How do you make sure that you write an exam that is actually fair in the sense of testing what you want? You show the students all semester what you expect of them. So I'm going to talk a little bit about midterm design, and then I'm going to talk about designing final exams. Now, I believe assessment happens outside of graded exams, whether they're midterms or finals. In fact, I do assessments of various kinds in almost all of my classes. I do weekly projects, but that's something very, very much more that Professor Behader is going to speak about. So I'm going to focus on the design of midterms. I've chosen today to talk specifically about the design of my first year class, because I do think that a lot of the things that we do in first year apply as well to the upper level, but maybe less so. There's a degree to which upper level classes are more about their subject matter and first year classes are more about everything. So I'm going to focus on the everything. First midterm, I give 2 graded midterms in my first semester course. The first one I do within the first month of classes. I assign this one, I had students to complete this one in groups, and I do assign them to the groups. And the reason I do that is I want students to reach out to other people. It counts for almost nothing. Counts for just enough, since it's probably the first graded work they're doing, that they care, but pretty quickly they've realized that it counted for almost nothing. That's where I get away with lowering the stakes. So what am I doing when I'm designing those kinds of exams? I'm actually trying to use that experience to teach people what we're looking for. We've covered little enough material that the entire focus of that exam is just to have them get something on paper so that I can give feedback that is designed to show where they're explaining their reasoning, where they're spelling them out. And almost all of the comments that I'm going to give on those are about the kind of analytical reasoning skills that they're going to need to do well on any law school exam. Very little of it is about the substantive material. I do a much more, worth somewhat more in my class, individual closed book, not take home except here in COVID world, midterm later on in the semester. That one covers far more of the substantive material. When I give feedback on that, my goal is to give students both kinds of feedback. I want them to see substantively what they should have gone into the exam knowing and doing, what they should have seen in the exam problem, and I want to talk to them about how to improve their own exam performance. So I've written an exam question. The first thing I do after I write the exam question, I'm going to talk in a little bit about how do I write exam questions, but the first thing I do is put at least usually about a week into doing something that is going to be, the students call it a grading rubric, but it's not a grading rubric. It is essentially a model answer written in outline chart form. Why? Because I want my students to see everything that could have been brought up, but I also want them to categorize it. I want them to not just look at all of the details on a list of things that might be brought up, but I want them to see conceptually how they fit into the large areas of the things that I'm trying to teach, in this instance, contracts. So there will be an entire section on contract formation. There'll be a small section on promissory estoppel if a contract was not formed. There'll be a small section, a larger section on defenses, because I will probably have covered defenses by then. I will have just begun talking about damages. I test it anyway. This makes my students really unhappy because they don't feel prepared for it. But I'm trying to teach them that formative assessment means seeing how you're doing at that moment, and that I don't expect them to know more than they've learned. Within each of those categories, I'll break out what am I looking for, how many points am I awarding, what was the expectation in there. That when the students get that back, that is the entire substantive answer answer that I was looking for. But then that's not the feedback. The grading sheet that I've given them literally just has a few points allocated for each of those broad categories. Now I need to give them an understanding of what they needed to do to have gotten more points in that category. And usually it isn't get everything on the list. None of us really expect, I don't think, that our students see and find and identify every single possible issue that could ever be covered, nor do we think that that's the path to righteousness. What we want is for the students to see the main ones and for them to do a good job of thoughtfully analyzing the most important things that they've found. So my next goal is to figure out a way to give feedback to my students that'll help them understand that. I have done that in writing. When I have too many students, I do that through written comment. If I have over 100 students, I'm going to give them written feedback. It's going to be not as thorough. When I have fewer than that, when I've had 55 students, 35 students, I use the technology that we have and I do voice recordings for every one of my students. Why? Because I can do a voice recording in about 15 minutes, of 5 minutes of comments to my students. I can include tone. I can include the kind of commentary that I would never bother to write down about, well, I thought you did a good job on this part, but it wasn't as important an issue, which is why you didn't get as many points in this category, even though you did a very nice job on this particular kind of comment. The goal is to help them see what is it are they supposed to be mastering in addition to the substantive material, because they can get that from my 2-page grading chart. So the goal of all of these assignments is to build expectations so that when students go into the final, they know what I'm looking for, they know what they're expected to do, and now they should have mastered and outlined all the substantive material. So how do I design and write a particular final exam? Well, first thing is I want to test what I teach. It has to include the ability to use good legal judgment, the ability to apply and correctly state and to use all of the legal rules that I've provided them, the ability to understand it, the ability to think conceptually about the material and get why are they learning all of this stuff. So I have traditionally in my contracts exam, for example, included sections that emphasize each of those. I have 3 main sections almost always in the way that I design my exam. One is the main question. It varies depending on how complex it is, in what percentage of the grade it is, but anywhere up to 50% of the grade. It's the first thing the students tackle. My goal is to make it as short as possible. I have not ever managed to bring that under about 2.5 pages because contracts material requires a fair amount of dialogue and conversation. When I was teaching torts, I was able to write shorter exams and that made me happy because I don't think that exam writing should include speed reading for the students. And some students simply read and grasp material more quickly than others. And in a timed exam, I think that matters. So I'm trying to make it as short as possible. My students now know to expect from me, although they didn't used to, that if they're taking a contracts exam, there will be a contract on the contracts exam. This was shocking to my students at first. Even though I use a textbook, I want to give a shout out to Michael Hunter Schwartz's textbook in contracts, which I think is superb and includes contractual language presented in the form of contract in a little neat box, a text box in all the pages. So that's what's going to be on my final. Why? Because if I expect them to analyze contractual language, there should be some things that look like contractual language. That's the main question will include all sorts of issue spotting expectations, including all of the basics, contract formation, some defenses, some of the other things. I then am going to include some short answer questions. Why do I include short answer questions? Because students get annoyed if they have put a huge amount of time into mastering material that is not covered on the test. And writing one large question that covers all of the issues that students have studied makes for a very unwieldy question. And so there's just going to be some stuff that doesn't fit. And so I find the short answers to be good ways of covering things that didn't quite fit in the main question, but I know I want to include. I often make them, you touch on 2 issues at a time, 2 topics at a time, and the students know that and come to expect it. The third section that I always include is a policy question. Do my students do well in writing a policy question at the end of a long exam? No, they do not. The answers usually tend to be fairly terrible. So why do I include a policy question? Because all semester I can tell my students there will be a policy question on your final exam. And I want students thinking about ideas, thinking about concepts, and trying to understand and ask themselves, why are these rules the way they are? Because I think that that's an important way of making sense and understanding the material, and therefore knowing how to use it better. And so I'm thrilled if the students do a great job with the policy question, but I don't need them to do a great job with the policy question in order for that to be a valuable part of my exam. So how do I grade it? Miserably. My personal approach to grading exams is to grade as quickly as possible. And that's because I'm afraid that I will drift too much in how I grade over time. So as much as as I don't like 12-hour days of grading, I think I do a better job if I can do all of like one chunk of questions in a day or two, rather than spreading it out over too much time. Then I'll spend so much of my time cross-checking what I do. And I do believe in cross-checking. The first 10 exams that I grade, first of all, I'm constantly changing my own grading sheet. So because I expect that students will see things in questions in a different way than I did. And so I'm willing to say some of their ways of seeing it may be wrong, but it might affect the way I allocate points in the various topics. Some of the things that they see, I think, hey, that's a good idea. And I think it's my job to therefore adjust my expectations if the students see something that I don't. So I treat the first 10 or so exams that I'm grading as provisional and as checks on my grading. I then put them aside and don't look at them again, and I regrade those exams at the end. What do I do while I'm grading? I pick one section, usually the main question I do first. I grade all of that question for all of the exams. I cross-check every 20 papers. I go back and look at 120 papers earlier to say, would I grade it the same way? And my goal is to control for my own desire to start rushing quickly through things, to either get thrilled when I see something that no one else did, but not over award it. To check my own tendencies, my bias is I over reward good writing. If you write something that's really just well written to me on an exam, I'm going to grade it too high. And that's not necessarily fair on a closed book timed exam, because some people simply have that skill in first draft that others don't. And I feel like that is a fine thing to reward on a paper, but not a fine thing to reward on an exam. So that means I'm going to change a little bit what I'm doing. So I'm cross-checking that. When I finish that main question, next thing I'm going to do is go back, I'm going to take a break and I'm going to have a nice cocktail. But when I come back to it the next day, I'm going to rearrange the order of those papers. I pick them all up and change what I'm doing so that if there's an advantage to being first, middle, or last, at least that advantage is fairly spread out for each section. And then I'm going to do it again. And I follow each of those procedures. I do not give a lot of, I have put so much energy into giving feedback and giving as much meaningful formative assessment as I could over the course of the semester. I do not do as much of that on the final, because at that point, I think students have completed my class and are less interested in what I have to say. So I do prepare a grading sheet that I use for my own needs to record what points I'm awarding in each category. And of course, my students can look at it and ask me questions about it later, but I make it very clear that that's from my recollection, and I'm not designing it as a communication document, which means it can be much quicker. The graphics aren't as good, and I can get through it very quickly so that I don't have to spend any more of that December time than I need to. I'm sure that there's more details that we could talk about, but that seems like enough for now. So I will turn it over to the next speaker.
Well, thanks so much, Chris. Actually, I had a quick question for you before I turn it over to Rory. And that's this issue in hearing your description of how you work. A lot of it resonated with me, and I recalled things that I have tried to do over the years or experimented with. But one thing that struck me is this trying to understand how we manage student expectations about the whole process of examining and grading. I mean, how do you strike a good balance between meeting their expectations that are reasonable against those that might just be their expectations but aren't necessarily reasonable or aren't necessarily consistent with what you believe is good practice?
In terms of preparing for exams, or in terms of their actual performance once they've written one?
Well, I was thinking about like what you'd say to them during the course of during the time you're teaching the course, and then perhaps, I mean, you gave a great explanation on what you do at the end. So yeah, I guess in terms of preparing and sort of managing their expectations during the term.
Yeah, I feel like if my students don't know exactly what I'm going to be expecting them to do on my final exam before they take it, I haven't communicated well over the course of the semester. Keep in mind that they've gotten 2 graded midterms from me. They've actually done some other grade exercise, including negotiation exercise that is designed essentially to teach contractual terms, but in a fun way. They have done weekly formative assessment group projects that are not graded, but that we go over immediately in class. And I'm pretty rough with students in the sense of being perfectly willing to sort of jokingly say, yeah, this would get such and such grade, and here's why, but here's how you can improve it. Because I feel like that's my job, is to show them what I'm looking for over the course of the semester. If they don't know that by the end of the semester, either they weren't paying attention or I don't think I've done my job right. Does that mean that all of my students would agree with that? Not necessarily, but I hope the bulk would.
That's great. Thanks so much. Rory, let me pass it to you.
Okay, good afternoon. I'm here to talk more about assessment and feedback outside of the context of exam grading or construction, because that's an area that we often overlook. And so for years, I've tried to find ways to make assessment less of a separate thing that you have to do and more into something that isn't separate from teaching, doesn't increase your workload, yet allows you to increase your doctrinal coverage, improve student understanding and engagement, even in large doctrinal classes. And I was on my way to doing that at a really slow pace. But I want you to think about when the pandemic hit last spring. If you were like me, you had no idea that LMS meant learning management software in the spring of 2019. Coming from Kansas, I thought LMS was low moisture silage. And I thought Zoom was something my grandkid said when she wanted to go fast in her stroller. And just as I was panicking, being overloaded, Drexel Klein School of Law called and said, hey, in 4 weeks, we want you to teach a 4-credit online accelerated torts class using Blackboard and Zoom. And after briefly panicking, I realized this was kismet at work when the student evaluations came back. So what the pandemic did and having to teach this course was it speeded up the development of a pedagogy that I had been working on called directed reading. And this was a way to provide formative and summative assessment for every class in every course throughout the semester that only costs you about 40 minutes extra per class. But the students gain so much more. And in addition to this continuous and copious assessment, the method introduces and naturally incorporates some best practices pedagogy. Using the assessment methodology I'm about to describe to you, every single class you teach will be a flipped classroom. You will facilitate student context creation, or as Louis Schultz at FIU, who has written a lot more on this than I have, he calls facilitating their cognitive schema creation. You'll be using memory imprinting technique of pre-testing that Paula Manning talks about when she presents. And you will encourage the engagement of your usually less engaged students, which is really important as we think about the need for our pedagogy to be inclusive going forward. And the method and what you do as a teacher works the same way, whether you are in person, synchronous, or asynchronous. And the biggest achievement of this for all you non-narcissistic law professors out there is that your student evaluations will be the envy of your colleagues. Once I started doing this baptism by fire, my student evaluations have been at a level consistently across modalities and law schools that I never expected I would have. There's only one tiny radical component you have to implement to achieve this, though. You have to instruct your students never to brief a case again. Wait, you're panicking. And they are initially and cluelessly happy that they don't have to brief. But they soon realize that the method I'm talking about results in more work for them, and they end up having to read the cases way more carefully than they would have if they briefed. So you give something and pretend to take something. And all this method entails, right, is coming up with a series of questions that form a discovery sequence exercise. And the students have to answer these questions before they come to each single class. So there's a series of questions that goes along with the reading that you've assigned for the class that they have to answer. And they have to submit written answers to these questions via a learning management software. And I teach at 8 a.m. and 9 a.m. typically. So my cutoff is midnight before. So I get up an hour earlier than I normally would to prep for class. And I give each of the students submissions for every class a score of 1, 0.75, 0.5, 0.25, or 0. And this is based solely on effort. Some of the questions they won't be able to get correct, but I want them trying to answer the question anyway. The cumulative scores of these assignments count for a percentage of their final grade. So for example, let's say I have 35 torts classes. Then there are 35 sets of answers they have to submit, and that's worth 35% of their final grade. So it's enough of a small grade that they aren't stressed, but it's also large enough that you put some skin in the game for them. You encourage them to make an effort. These questions, a lot of them are designed so that just a few require a baseline amount of effort. I might ask a few questions like, on what date did this happen in the case? What is the reason the court said? And so I'd go to those first, and if those weren't answered correctly, alarm bells would go off, and you'd spend a much closer time on the more complicated questions. But this is all possible because of the way a learning management software works. When you have these things submitted on an LMS like Blackboard or Canvas or D2L, they're put up there like on a menu on a plate for you, and you could skim through the answers quickly by just scrolling down and put some comments in a feedback box on the side. And so it takes about a minute to do an entire grading for one set of these questions. This isn't exam grading, it's more effort and engagement testing. So it doesn't take the same level of grading and time that an exam would take. But what this allowed, what I found out quite accidentally, is that this allowed us, in addition to providing this copious amount of formative and also summative assessment, it allowed us as a class to engage with the doctrine at a much more sophisticated level than when my students came into class after having just read and briefed in the traditional manner. And by skimming those student answers before class, I knew what topics the students had the most trouble with. I knew which topics students all blew out of the water, and I knew which topics, like maybe summary judgment and the burden of production when I teach civil procedure. So I could tailor my presentation to cater for where the students were struggling and where they weren't. And if you think about it, without this, we have all been going into our classes blind, assuming that all our students represent a level or a norm, and that's where we're teaching from. One other feature of this assessment method that's really helpful is if you're particularly ambitious, you could ask a random subsection of the class to send you their post-class answers. So you spend time in class discussing these questions, and it's no less engaging than in the typical class where students don't answer, but you ask these students to send their answers to you for just a few questions after they've had the class. And you can compare their pre and post-class answers to the same questions, and you can actually self-assess whether your learning goals have been met, so you could judge where they were before class and where they are after class. So just because a student smiles and nods and looks at you like they admire you doesn't mean they're learning. This is a tangible way to assess what they've learned. And so in class, you're working as a class to answer these questions. And the way I think of this is, if reading and briefing got a student 25% of the way there, this results in getting students 50% of the way there. This is just absolutely arbitrary numbers I'm throwing out, but I'm trying to have you think about it. And students still have a long way to go, because if you think of law school learning as a series of doctrinal boxes that are built, destroyed, and rebuilt, that's what cognitive schema formation is. They come into class with a nice, neat doctrinal box based on their answers to the questions or their reading and briefing on what they think the subject matter entails. And your job in class is to absolutely obliterate that box and empower them to go back after class and build a larger, more complicated, sophisticated box of knowledge, for lack of a better word. Your goal in class is not to build a box for them, because you have to ask yourself this question: what grade would your students get if they never read before class and they never did anything after class, but they just came to class and paid attention? And hopefully your answer is, my students would suck on my exam. And the reason is, learning is not teaching in the law school classroom. What you are doing in the law school classroom is empowering them and equipping them to build the complex cognitive schema that they have to do after class. We call it outlining, we call it assimilation, we call it all sorts of other things. But I just want to share with you some typical student comments for this method that I've used asynchronously, synchronously, hybrid, and in person now. Students tell me things like, we did not come into class feeling completely lost and unaware, waiting for the deer in the headlights feeling for an hour and a half, of feeling incompetent as we suddenly realized how little we knew compared to you. Answering the questions makes us think of the new material you were bringing to class, not in a vacuum, but in terms of how it added to our understanding of the assigned reading we already had, and answering the question helped us to focus and think about the doctrine more. We wanted to engage more because we felt more competent because of these questions. In class, we were immediately able to realize what we had misinterpreted and how to fix the way we read, or to show up what we thought the doctrine was. We could just go back after class and incorporate the material you brought into class into this basic framework. Answering the questions allowed us to create before class. So basically, by doing this assessment and providing this sort of feedback light that's both formative and summative, what we're doing is helping the students build the more complex cognitive schema. It's the 3 bites of the apple sort of analogy. They get 1 bite where they think of it and engage with the material with their own culturally derived learning preferences. Then they come to class and you engage with it at a very deep level, just like if you're teaching a regular class. And then they go back out of class, and rather than having this mess of stuff to try to recreate, they have a basic doctrinal and substantive framework that they can build on. Yet they're getting copious assessment. And my coverage has gone up significantly since I've started using this method, because I'm teaching students who are so much better primed than in a traditional read and brief environment by the time they come into class. So we're told not to use slides. So if you want to see this method in work, Jim will drop a link into the chat now. And it's not a plug. I just don't have any other way to give you context for this, but I just wrote a CivPro casebook that uses this method for the entire CivPro 1 and 2. And because what this method is really an active learning, constructivist way of doing assessment, the entire casebook is 400 pages long. But you ask my students who have used that 400 pages or have used this, and whether that means they work less. And students, it's kind of been a utopia, so I'm happy to share it. I stumbled into it. Students tell me I have to work so much harder preparing for your class than I do for other classes, but they say they don't mind because they know they're learning so much and they're getting so much assessment and feedback. And I've helped one other colleague at my school set up this method for her class. And she has said to me that she's never going back to the traditional teaching method because of the level of engagement. And, students absolutely appreciate tiny things like, well, the Venn diagram you drew showing the relationship of Federal Rule of Civil Procedure 20 and 1367A, supplemental jurisdiction is reversed. Rule 20 falls within that sphere. Just something that simple before a student comes to class, where you take off and you discuss the complicated aspects of supplemental jurisdiction, adds so much to that student mood. And so basically what I've tried to say is, by doing assessment and feedback and not thinking of it as something you have to do outside of teaching, But as part of good teaching, you will necessarily use all these modern pedagogy terms that seem so inaccessible until you just Nike commercial it, you just do it. And it's possible now with learning management software that this doesn't involve separate emails from students that you have to grade and write on and send back to them. It's all there, and you just shuffle through the answers of any learning management software and give them the feedback. So my students have the feedback before class starts. So I will get up an hour early and say, instead of getting up at 6, maybe I get up at 5:15 and I drink coffee and I go through that learning management software. And here's the empowering part of it. I tell my students, look at, in this class, you might be angry at me because I make you work so hard to prepare, but you are in charge of 35% of your final grade. I have nothing to do with it. That effort is yours alone. So you sort of empower the students and help them take control. And so Chris asked me to loop back to one other thing outside of this assessment method, and it had to do with the use of rubrics and exams. So I'll shift gears now and talk a little about that. I give mock exams, mock essay questions throughout my class, but then I give the students the grading rubric I would have used, and I have them exchange papers and I have them grade the exam. But they have to write on the rubric that I would have used why the student scored what they scored. So this allows the student to self-contextualize what it is I'm doing when I grade exams, and to be able to explain it as a master. You take the exam as a novice, and then you switch focus, and Michael Schwartz works a lot with this, and you view the material pretending to be an expert on the material when you're grading. And you'd be surprised, if you have a detailed enough rubric, students will say to other students, this was conclusory. You didn't apply the facts the way you should. But they're saying it having developed their own context for it. You're not telling the student you're conclusory. That means nothing until they could see what it means. And so for my final exam, students come into my office and they go, could I get my essay and the rubric, please? Because I believe I owe my students that for their exams, I have a detailed rubric that I use to score their essay. And so every exam I give them has the grading rubric with it, and they could go through and look at this rubric, and pretty much they go, okay, I understand. I don't really need to talk to you, because they've been trained to use rubrics and to understand and contextualize what I've been doing. And that's all I have. Now, I guess we could take questions. Thank you.
Great. Rory, we have, thank you both first for those great presentations. But Rory, I have 2 quick follow-up questions for you from the audience. The first is, do you give the students the answers to the questions? If so, and how?
I don't give them the answer to the questions, because I think that will shortcut what they're supposed to do after class, which is reconstruct the answers to the questions based on what we've done in class. And so they are free to ask me, is this correct? Where did I go wrong? But I don't give them the answers to the questions, because I think in this day and age, that leads to a lot of copy-paste type stuff, and it would short circuit the work I want them to do to get there.
And the second one is, how do you use the self-grading rubric exercise you described when you teach in an asynchronous online course?
Yeah, that's easy. You just have them email each other. You make up a list, a random, and you say, you email this person, you email this person, you send them the list, and then you email them the rubric. And you say, you come back to class the next, in an asynchronous situation, they'd be emailed the rubric, and then they would have to submit to you what they told the other student, or scan the rubric and send it back to you. And you aren't actually checking to see if they did all the work. That would be too much work for you for every rubric. What you're doing is seeing if a set amount number or a set percentage of the students, a critical mass, are understanding certain terms. And you may send an email, or you may post something saying, here's what you guys said. It's exactly what I would have said to you, but now you understand it on your terms.
One more quick question, and I'm going to go back to Chris. How large are the classes you're giving feedback to?
They range from 24 to 80 so far. And I'll be visiting at Touro Law School this year, and I'm told my torts class will be 70. And let me just be honest, without me tripping into the LMSs and that type of thing, this would have been impossible. The pandemic just provided that link I needed to make assessment contained and manageable. This would be impossible without learning management software.
Thanks, Rory. Chris,
Yeah.
first, could you tell us how large your classes typically are?
Depending on, in my school for first year classes, we have anything from what we call small sections, medium sections, and large sections, because our goal is to give students as many more individualized learning experiences as possible. So anything from like 28 or 35 to I have taught as large as 125. I have done the voice recorded comments on midterms that I've described for you for a class as large as 74. That was a really poor choice, a poor life choice for me. And so I would not necessarily repeat it for a group that large, but it's possible. And it's more importantly, it's possible to do it and do it quickly. I believe that if students don't get feedback quickly when they do midterms, the midterms had little value. So no matter what the size of my class is, my target goal is to get the midterms back graded in their hands within 2 weeks and 10 days if I can make it happen.
Great. And I think you have a couple of things you want to add about the process of writing exam questions.
Yeah, the one thing I wanted to say is it's really important to start early. And the reason it's important to start early is we need time to reflect and look at questions. You have to be able to imagine what you're thinking when you write an exam question, but you also have to be able to imagine what someone else is thinking when they read it. And those are two entirely different things. I tend to start writing at least 2 to 3 weeks before the exam is due. And my goal is to spend about a week on the hardest question. My main question is the hardest one to write. It usually takes me the better part of a week. And then I put it aside. I don't want to look at it. My usual practice is to try to get it written before Thanksgiving. And that way I have all of Thanksgiving with all of the things that it involves to not think about it, so that when I come back and read it, I can read it fresh. I inevitably and invariably have at least 2 of my colleagues read all of my exams. In part because they're going to, catch anything that I didn't correct, but also because anything that they ask me questions about or seem especially interested in is going to tell me what my students are going to focus on. And that's a really important part of sort of how to give myself the time and space to make sure that my exam is clear. I also, I believe that it's important I tend to specify exactly how much time on the exam the students should spend on each question. And I indicate on the exam what each question is worth. And I think that's important for students to understand exactly how to sort of manage their own time and expectation as they're doing the work.
Thank you. Chris, I'm going to stay with you and pitch you a question from my former colleague at Stetson, Becky Morgan, who is asked this. She says, I'm interested in suggestions on how to emphasize the word choice when drafting and dealing with statutes. Precision in word choice may affect intent and outcome. Any suggestions?
The biggest one I would have is that has to be something, if that's a thing that you care a lot about in your particular course, it's a thing that has to be emphasized and done throughout the semester. You can write questions that, where in many ways word choice hinges, the correct answer to, if there is a correct answer to your particular question, hinges upon word choice. And you'll be able to assess in your final exam whether the students have done that. But you will have a very unhappy December, as I described before, or if you're doing it in spring semester, you'll have a very unhappy May if you haven't prepared your students for that all semester, which means you've got to include formative assessment exercises that show that. You've got to tell your students that. You got to say right out, word choices matter enormously. Lawyers pick our words incredibly carefully, and here's why. You've got to show them examples of it and go over it in class. Whether you count it for a grade, call it a midterm, don't count it for a grade, don't call it a midterm, is less important than consistently communicating that this is a thing that matters, and it matters not just because you uniquely care about it, but because it matters for lawyers to learn, but that you uniquely will be testing on it, and that that's something they should expect. Then you write a question that obviously emphasizes the specifics, or nuances of individual linguistic choices, and you make sure that you assess it. The one piece of advice I would give is you design a question in which if the students do it wrong, if they miss that nuance, there's still something there that they can get some credit for. Although it'll be lesser credit than if they've seen and recognized exactly what you're looking at. Otherwise, what will end up happening is you have too sort of binary a split in how your students perform, and that doesn't work for your own grading. And so you want to design something that has a little bit of something for everything, and yet more for the students who actually learn the lesson that you spent the semester to try to teach them.
Thank you. Another audience question is, any ideas on collaborative assessments, such as between a doctrinal class and legal writing, or about the practical interactions of multiple areas of law? Would either of you like to address that one?
I will, because I've done it, although not on an exam. I have done it by combining with all sorts of things, including our what we call Foundations for the Study of Law, which is essentially our academic support programming. I've done work with our legal practice program, which is a sort of practice-based lawyering legal writing program. We have not tested together, but we have done exercises where the students were working on things that I knew were going to be a struggle on my test in that class. For example, my students never feel confident that they understand parole evidence. I don't know if anybody does feel confident that they understand parole evidence, but I know that my students do not. And so we decided that, hey, maybe it would be a good idea to emphasize that in more than one class. And so when I worked with the legal practice professors, they designed essentially a client interview and some follow-up, legal analytical work that the students were expected to do. And we taught parts of the unit together in both classes in order to make sure that the students knew that we each valued it and that it was important in both contexts. I didn't test specifically on that unit, but I did test parole evidence, and that year it was better.
Thank you. Rory.
Is it possible for me to revisit the statutory question as well?
Absolutely.
So I became really interested in stand your ground law after the Trayvon Martin incident quite a few years ago. And if you want to teach your students the importance of statutory interpretation, the Florida Stand Your Ground statute provides an excellent example, because at points in the statute, they use the word or, for example, to mean an equivalency. They use the word or to mean the opposite. They very subtly say things that are buried in the statute that are incredibly powerful and meaningless until you read the statute exactly and precisely. So you see how much damage the statute is doing to the status quo in terms of criminal proof and defense. Things like the police aren't even able to investigate, to arrest the person if the presumption shows that they acted the way they were supposed to, and suing someone who allegedly used self-defense in a certain deadly force in self-defense. If you sue them and the presumptions, which is based on minimal investigation, shows that they were entitled to, then you're responsible for their court costs. But to cut a long story short, in this day and age, when we're focusing so much on disparate treatment of certain members by law enforcement, if anybody wants it, I have actually developed an exercise with an instructor's guide that goes through the Florida statute and shows the importance of precision language. And I'm happy to share anything with anybody who wants it.
Rory, that's a great lead in to the next question I had. Our most recent faculty focus session was on dealing with sensitive issues in the classroom. And I was hoping that you two might give us some ideas, opinions, or thoughts about dealing with sensitive issues on examinations, especially ones that could trigger certain students.
My first response initially would be simply to say, we have to deal with sensitive issues that might be triggering in the classroom and in our materials. We actually don't necessarily have to do that on exams. And I would strongly advise people to try to avoid it, but it means being thoughtful about what is triggering. For example, thinking about issues of wealth in some of the examples that we use might not immediately jump to people as triggering, but it is for students who aren't necessarily certain that they belong in the law classroom if they believe that the law classroom is particularly welcoming to wealthier students. So there's a lot that goes into that. I mean, I don't mean to make light of the topic of triggering, but another thing that I think is true about exams is I want in my exam experience for students to feel like everyone had an equal footing, which includes things like, I love including pop culture references in the slides that I use in class and the examples I use in class. I do not use pop culture references anywhere in my exams. And that's because my experience with that is the students know the reference, even if it's not a particular movie that they've seen or TV characters that they're familiar with, but they're always afraid that they're missing something if they're not familiar with it, or they're bringing in too much from what they've seen in that program or read in that book if they are familiar with it. Either way, it puts people on different footing. So I think my goal is to try to keep that out of exams as much as possible. That's one of the other reasons why I'm having as many colleagues as I can read my exams and asking for that kind of feedback, which doesn't answer at all your question as to how to deal with it in class, but that's a far, far more difficult topic that I get to leave to others, maybe Rory.
I'm not sure I could answer it, but I will tell you this, for better or for worse, the last 4.5 years have made me begin to focus a ton of my research on the implicit biases and the norms that exist in society, and to see the extent that those norms perpetuate a status quo of keeping hierarchies in the position they are in society. And so what I find dealing with a triggering incident, what's even harder is the way the majority of the class reacts to the triggered student. So I have, in other words, the eye rolling, the why does that bother you? So I have dedicated a lot of my time, and in the Torts book I wrote with Meredith Duncan and Ron Turner, we've tried to dedicate a lot of our time and a lot of our effort to making those things forefront. In other words, by addressing them head on. If somebody says something and they're like, oh my gosh, that again, that upset you, that's typically what happens in class. I try to flip the narrative to show the people who don't understand and to try to draw an analogy between something that somebody else would think is unimportant to them. And then I always try, and my students are probably sick of it, to relate that reaction that they have to a deeply seated way of cognitive processing that's ingrained in our society that renders certain things unimportant to the people who don't need for it to be important. So I try to hit it head on.
Thank you. In doing annual meetings with faculty over the years, I feel like more and more frequently, one thing that faculty express concern about is that students don't know what to do when they come in for a final exam review. You know, they request it and they get there and then they don't know how to ask questions or engage. Do you have any advice for faculty members about how to give advice to their students about how they should conduct themselves in any sort of review they do for you with regarding an assessment, whether a midterm, other formative assessment, or even the final exam? Chris.
First, teach it. This is, let's be honest, this is probably easier if you're teaching first-year students because there's a greater expectation and permission to sort of acclimate them to law school. You know, your upper-level students you might need to pitch this a little differently. But one of the first things I teach students, for example, is this applies in my class, but you should probably apply it in all classes. 24-hour rule. You may not ask me substantive questions about law within 24 hours before an exam. Why? Because it's always going to be the tiny, tiny little points that you're obsessing about, and then you're going to get over-focused on it no matter how I respond. But you also may not contact me about an exam within 24 hours of getting feedback. Why? Essentially for the students' protection, so that they understand that like they need time to reflect before they figure out how to talk to a professor. Because We all know that that student who just dumps on you and then is mortified by the fact that he or she did, and then you kind of never hear from them again. I want to keep them from doing that. So that's the first setup. But the next part is I'm going to teach them about how to make sure that it's an effective meeting. I'm going to talk to them about the fact that the first thing they need to do is reread, that the most important part of an exam review is them rereading their own paper. And if they reread their own paper carefully, with an eye of looking at whatever grading sheet I provided or rubric that has been given to them, and then they formulate questions, they are likely to get the most specific feedback. They're likely to get the most helpful commentary, and they're likely to engage me and any other professor for the longest time possible. And it's actually kind of true.
So I also think that we as faculty members do a really poor job of using the language of experts to try to explain concepts to novices. So like for example, let's think about this. If you tell a preschooler that, I want you to remember the letter A is an isosceles triangle with the base out of place, they're gonna not hear what, they're not gonna understand what you said. And we do that all the time. We say things to new law students: you didn't apply law to facts, you didn't brief properly. Well, a brief to some law students is just an alternative to a boxer. We assume that by telling them these things, they're understanding it, which is why it's so important for me, for my students to actually practice grading exams. So they'll know what to ask, they'll know what to look for. You tell a student it's conclusory and then you're frustrated. Man, I told the student it's conclusory and they don't get it. Well, it's like, it's like calling something a strigiformes instead of a type of bird. So we have to make sure that our students, not only we're delivering it, because delivering the information is not them receiving the information. We have to make sure we facilitate their own contextualization of these concepts. Where even like it's Iraq, like I have some students, I do a contextualization experiment with them, and they say, oh, Iraq is like peeling an onion, it makes you cry. And then they go, no, I mean, you have to peel off the outer layer. Students are able to say, Iraqing is like shopping at a fancy grocery store instead of all these. There's a bag, and there's a rule for the things that go into that bag. It had to have been an animal. It had to have been a cleaning supply. So when you allow students to contextualize these things that they don't understand when we tell them a million times, and this is a Laurie Zimmett spiel I'm repeating, right? They don't receive it unless they understand it. So you have to create an environment where all these things that we say year after year and we're frustrated because we've said it, hits home with the student rather than a set of words that they nod and go, wow, my professor knows big words.
Thank you. Final question. Most schools are still in pandemic mode with hybrid classes, a lot of classes online, and a lot of examinations online. Do you have any insights or advice for professors who are preparing exams that will be taken by students online at the end of this semester?
I'll go with that one because I learned the hard way. Once you put it online, you can never use it again. Consider it a goodbye. So if you have some classic multiple choice questions or some super essays that you rerun every 11 years or a variation of them, once it's online, it's gone. But if you realize that there's more room for assessment sort of, how should I say, irregularities with online exams, because students, whether you say open book or not, you're going to have to assume it's open book. So it worked out well with the technique I'm using now for my online and in-person classes, that the final is worth less than it used to be, but the in-class assessment counts towards the grade more. I've also, and there's no pedagogy for this, but I also make my online exams a little more of a time crunch than my non-online exams would be, because I'm trying to create a striation between the people with the most knowledge and the people with the least knowledge. And in my unscientific way, I haven't been surprised by grades yet if I use a very more time crunch online final than I would a non-online final.
Well, I'd like to thank both of our distinguished guests for this extraordinary presentation. It's so timely. I hope that people will find that this information is coming to them at a point in time when they can use it. And I look forward to joining you again at our next Faculty Focus. Once again, my special thanks, and on behalf of Darby and myself and all of us at the AALS, thanks to Professor Behader and to, I think our other guest has disappeared. No, there she is, and to Professor Franklin. I thought I'd lost her on my screen for joining us today. Have a great evening.